Hello, F5 community, and good morning. In November of 2021, F5 began to release quarterly security notifications in lieu of ad hoc CVEs in an effort to simplify customer mitigation steps as well as to minimize outages or downtime that may occur in the environments that they protect. I'm Aubrey King with Dev Central, and today is Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2024. I'm joined today by Aaron Brailsford from F5's Security Incident Response Team, who is here to deliver the quarterly security notification to us. How you doing, Aaron?
Hey, Aubrey, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. As always, we couldn't do it without you.
No problem. Like you say, it is Valentine's Day, and we arranged a quarterly security notification for Valentine's Day as our little present to everybody. We disclosed 22 issues at 7 a.m. Seattle time, which is a minute ago. The good news for this Valentine's Day present is that there are 0 criticals and no external research of vulnerabilities. That typically tends to drive less interest in the QSN and gives everybody a little bit more breathing room. The bad news is the impacted products are most of the product suite, so BIG-IP TMOS, BIG-IP Next, VE, SBK CNF, BIG-IQ, F5OS, and Nginx Plus and open source are all impacted. Distributed cloud, as for mesh, and nothing else is impacted though. The next QSN, as always, we publish the date of the next QSN with this QSN. So the next QSN is on May 8th. We can break down the 22 vulnerabilities a little bit. We have 14 highs, 5 mediums, 1 low, and 2 security exposures. I'll dig into the exposures in a couple of slides' time, into one of them at least, and what an exposure is, just to remind everybody. 17 of these vulnerabilities affect BIG-IP TMOS, so that's classic BIG-IP, things like LTM, ASM, AFM, and so on. 1 impacts Next, V20, 3 for SBK, 2 for CNF, and a handful for the other products. Perhaps unusually for this QSN, 13 are data plane issues. That is, they affect things that handle client traffic, so virtual servers, NATs, SNATs, and so on. And 9 are control plane. And we typically seen more control plane than data plane in previous QSNs. It's the other way around this time. As always, this is the same message we repeat with every QSN. We recommend customers install the latest releases. So if you're on the latest releases at this time, which are all on screen, I won't read them all out, you're in a good place with regard to everything that we've disclosed today. The only exception there is BIG-IQ 830, where what we disclosed today did not make it into a release in time. There is an engineering hotfix available on downloads on my.f5.com in case you need those fixes. Unusually, this QSN, as I say, we have Nginx covered. If you're on R31P1 of Plus or OSS 1.25.4, you're in a good place. But I'll dig into the Nginx vulnerabilities on the next slide, and you'll probably see that you aren't impacted in the vast majority of cases. So just to spotlight some things. Our highest CVSS score is an 8.7 high, CVE 2024-22093. But mitigating this, it's a control plane vulnerability, so it's not data plane. It requires an authenticated attacker with administrator privileges, so an attacker must have stolen privileges somehow previously. And it allows the attacker to break out of appliance mode, so it only impacts systems running in appliance mode. I think we've seen this in a number of QSNs now. But it also only impacts multi-bladed systems, so things like Viprion, and only if they're in appliance mode, not in standard mode deployment. So the impact for most people is nil, and the impact for those people who are running appliance mode on a multi-bladed system is you really want to be restricting access to the configuration utility, which is standard practice, and ensure that you have tight control on administrator credentials. The second one to highlight here, CVE 2024-21771, is another 7.5 high data plane issue. This only impacts big IP AFM if you are using the protocol inspection signatures. It can cause high CPU, which could lead to a denial of service, but won't necessarily lead to a denial of service. If you are running the latest updates for the signature files, you are unaffected. Or if you're running any of the fixed releases, you're unaffected. Therefore, most people are probably in a good place already because you'll be on an up-to-date signature file if you're using protocol inspection, but maybe take a look at any AFM and IPS systems you've got just to make sure. And I said I'd circle back to those Nginx issues. So there are two CVEs for Nginx Plus and OSS, 2024-24989 and 2024-24990 there. They're both 7.5 high denial of service CVEs, but they impact the experimental HTTP 3 feature. We typically don't suggest running experimental features in production, so you probably aren't impacted in a production environment, but if you are running HTTP 3 in production, an attacker could crash the worker processes, which could lead to a denial of service. And the only mitigation, aside from being on a fixed release, of course, is to disable HTTP 3 if you're using it. Just two more things that I wanted to call out then of the 22 that we disclosed. CVE 2024-23982 is another 7.5 high, but it impacts big IP PEM with classification profiles and only on UDP virtual servers. If you are using PEM classification profiles on UDP virtual servers, then you're probably in a good place because it only affects the classification engine updates released between September 2022 and February 2023. And obviously we're in February 2024 now. If you're either using the classification profiles that were delivered with the system at installation time, so you've never updated, or you're using a later signature file, then you're not impacted. The impacted signatures have already been removed from MyF5, so you can't download them and make yourself accidentally vulnerable. And I think similar to the AFM issue, you're most likely either using the system default signatures or you are someone who keeps completely up to date with the signatures, in which case you're not impacted. The last issue to call out is one of those security exposures. So just to remind people, a security exposure is an issue where the CIA, that is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the big IP itself, isn't impacted, but we may pass traffic to a backend system which shouldn't have gone to that backend system. In other words, we break a security promise that the big IP makes. That could potentially lead to impacting the CIA of the backend infrastructure or the customer data held on it. We call these security exposures rather than vulnerabilities because we want to make them distinct and because we don't give them a CVSS score. We highly recommend everybody considers a security exposure as a high, so somewhere around a 7.5. But we can't score it without knowing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements of the backend system, or indeed whether or not there is any requirement for CIA on the backend system. And therefore, we can't score it for you, but you could go through your own scoring exercise for these. Anyway, this security exposure, if you are using locally loaded CRL files, so certificate revocation lists, and by locally loaded, I mean you put the CRL file on the big IP and then you load it with a TMSH command typically, they may not fully load. If they don't fully load, that will result in traffic from clients potentially passing when it shouldn't. So if you are using, say, client certificate authentication in a client SSL profile, or you are validating server certificates in a server SSL profile, and you're using CRL files, if the CRL file fails to fully load, then we consider all certificates presented to us as valid. So if you were doing client certificate auth, for example, and a client presented a revoked certificate because it's in the CRL, we wouldn't know that it's revoked, and we would pass that traffic to the backend server as though the client certificate were valid. If you're using CRLDP or OCSP, you aren't affected. It's only locally loaded CRL files, and it affects potentially all locally loaded CRL files, regardless of size, even those smaller than the 192 megabyte file size limit that we have published on my F5. And unfortunately, it's a silent failure. So if the serial file fails to load, it does so silently. It doesn't log anything. We just start accepting traffic that we shouldn't accept. In versions where ID 131.6277 is fixed, we will log to varlog LTM when we fail to load the CRL file. And the big IP will also invalidate the SSL profile that CRL file was associated with, meaning that all traffic will be rejected. So if you're doing client certificate auth in client SSL and the CRL file fails to load, we will reject all client certificates. You will have a traffic outage, but that is better than allowing all traffic if you're relying on client certificate auth to block potentially malicious traffic. And that is everything, at least everything that I wanted to highlight today, the 22 that we released.
Well, that ultimately sounds good to me. And judging by the lack of questions in the chat, it sounds like the community sounds pretty positive about this one as well. Is that am I reading this fairly correctly?
Yeah, so I think although 22 is a high number, it's far from the largest QSM we've had. We did have one with 40 something.
Okay.
And I think most of our customers are now pretty used to dealing with QSNs. Well, that's the feedback that we get. They know to plan for the next QSN happening. Everybody's getting more used to being on an up-to-date version, so they're in a better place when the QSN happens. And I think we are continually improving our documentation on my F5 to cover off the common questions that people have. But, as always, if people do have questions, they can reach out to support. Those questions will go through to most likely a security specialist, so someone who is trained and is knowledgeable in handling security questions, and will get you the answers that you need.
Nice. And it looks like we do have a couple of questions coming in. The first one coming in from Josh, who says he is not that familiar with the CRL file format and asks, would it fail to load to invalid entry, or does that cause any validation error when attempting to add the file to the big IP?
No, so it's actually not failing to load because the contents of the file are invalid. It's failing to load because I can... To talk to the specifics of that bug, it's a combination of the size of the CRL file and the memory state of the big IP. Unfortunately, we can't give you like a deterministic way to say a CRL file of 20 megabytes is fine if I have this much memory free, because it also depends on how fragmented the memory is, which is going to depend on how long the box has been up, the kind of traffic it's passing, all of the rest of the configuration on the box. So a serial file could fail to load when it's 50 meg, or it could fail to load when it's 100 meg. It's going to vary wildly. And when it fails to load, like I say, there's no log to say that it's failed to loaded. It just quietly doesn't work. And then traffic fails open. We stop applying the contents of the CRL file to incoming certificates.
Now, do we have any idea on how esoteric this sort of use case would be? I mean, from my time in working with customers, 12 years out in the field, I didn't see a whole lot in terms of CRL specifically. Yeah,
so I mean, client certificate auth is fairly prevalent. But I think typically people are using OCSP or CRLDP now.
Right.
There are some very high throughput situations where they might prefer locally loaded CRL files for performance reasons. Like Daniel says, OCSP is far more flexible, relatively low latency, and considerably more robust. And also, there is an overall file size limit of 192 meg that we support on version 15.1 and onwards for CRL files. So if you do have extremely large amounts of revoked certificates, CRL files just aren't appropriate anyway. You need OCSP or CRLDP that aren't subject to that limitation.
Okay. Well, that's I think probably an appropriate answer. And looking at the chat, I'm not seeing a whole lot that is fairly pertinent. We've got a couple of nice comments, of course. Here's one for sure. It is good to know when to expect these. I couldn't be in any more agreement. I mean, imagine if we had 22 ad hoc CVEs that were kind of put out. That would be a whole lot of work for all of our customers, as well as Aaron and I. We'd never have any sleep. So
yeah, I mean, if you go back over a little over a year, right, that we've been doing these. What was our first QSM? It was January 2022, actually. So 2 years at this point. We used to disclose with almost every release of Classic Big IP, there would be something to disclose, and that caused an enormous amount of churn for us and for customers. So I think QSNs, obviously, there is always, as we saw in October, the risk of an out-of-band security notification if our hand is forced.
Yep.
But we do our very best to avoid those and give everybody a very predictable cadence.
Yeah, those have been fairly rare since I've been helping you with these. So
yeah, just two. One in November 2022 and one in October 2023. And they're both in the overview article now.
Yep, that's always a big surprise. So, and with that, it looks like we are down to no more comments or questions in the chat. So, Aaron, thank you for coming and joining me to deliver the QSN to the community and to the world.
No problem. As always, you're welcome.
Awesome. And thank you, community, for keeping tuned to the quarterly security notification. Of course, vulnerability disclosure and remediation is a part of everything that we do in terms of security. And we use this process really as kind of a reflection of our efforts to stay vigilant and focused on constant improvement. With that, again, the reminder is we'll be back March. You didn't say March 8th, May 8th.
May 8th. Yep.
May 8th for the next quarterly security notification. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Aubrey with Dev Central and Aaron from the F5 Cert.